Welcome to the Deep Dive. I am your host, and I am just so glad you are joining us today.
And I'm your resident expert for today's deep dive. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you because we are getting into a question today that is, well, it's bound to challenge some serious assumptions you might have.
Oh, absolutely. It challenges the status quo in a major way.
Right. So we were taking a stack of notes and research from a really fascinating source document. It's titled From Parallel Efforts to Collective Impact. And our mission today is to distill all this down to its most crucial insights.
Which is really about confronting an uncomfortable paradox.
Exactly. Think about global missions or charitable work or large-scale community initiatives. If you had to guess the greatest obstacle to their success today, what would you say it is?
Most people would probably assume it's outside opposition.
Right, or like shifting cultural trends, or maybe just a sheer lack of funding.
Sure, that makes sense on the surface.
But the premise we are exploring today suggests something entirely different. What if the greatest obstacle is actually the quiet, polite fragmentation within these organizations themselves?
It's a striking premise to start with, honestly, because we live in an era that absolutely idolizes heroic individualism.
We really do.
You see it everywhere, right? We celebrate the lone visionary leader who builds their own empire, or the standalone startup that just disrupts an entire industry by itself.
Yeah, the whole lone wolf mentality.
Exactly. But this source material challenges that modern obsession head on. The viewpoint here is that this hyper-individualistic mindset has quietly seeped into how religious, charitable, and missional organizations operate.
As a result of that.
A massive dilution of real-world impact. So our goal today is to impartially explore these ideas. We want to understand why massive amounts of energy and resources often yield disproportionately small results, and then examine a pretty radical strategy for fixing it.
All right, we are basically acting as your guides through these concepts today. It's an exploration of how we work together, or to be more accurate, how we constantly fail to work together. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
There is a concept introduced early on describing modern missional culture as being busy but divided. The idea is that our current professional culture quietly rewards independence over everything else.
It really encourages leaders to build their personal brands.
Yeah, and to protect their institutional turf. They measure success purely by individual organizational growth. It feels very much like a corporate marketplace mentality has just completely taken over spaces that are supposed to be collaborative.
And that marketplace mentality creates a crucial distinction. We have to look at the difference between movement and momentum.
Movement and momentum, they sound like the same thing.
They do sound the same, but they are radically different. I mean, we have a ton of movement right now. But movement is just busy activity. It's organizations launching new initiatives every month, or leaders working tirelessly with calendars full of events.
Want constant motion.
Right. But momentum. Momentum is unified force. There is a brilliant analogy in our sources that really clarifies this. Imagine a massive rowboat sitting in the water.
Right.
If you have 100 incredibly strong people in that boat, and they are all rowing as hard as they possibly can, but they're all rowing in completely different directions, what actually happens?
But they just exhaust themselves. The water is churning, there's a lot of splashing, but the boat basically just spins in circles or goes absolutely nowhere.
Precisely. That is movement without momentum.
Yeah.
But if you take just 10 of those people and have them row in perfect synchrony, they can cross an ocean.
Wow.
The argument being made here is that the global mission space is filled with incredibly well-intentioned, hardworking people who are simply rowing in different directions. They are moving fast and burning themselves out, but they completely lack the directional power that only comes from deep alignment.
And what's wild about this perspective is how it describes that lack of alignment. Because this competition rarely looks like open hostility.
Right. You aren't seeing leaders of different charities shouting at each other in the streets.
No, it's much quieter, which actually makes it far more dangerous. It shows up as this polite distance dressed up as professionalism.
Polite distance, yes.
If you work in this space, or any corporate space really, you know exactly what this looks like. We've all been in those partnership meetings where everyone is smiling and nodding and shaking hands.
But you know absolutely nothing real is going to get shared.
Exactly. Nothing real gets accomplished once the Zoom call ends. It's just duplicated programs and guarded information and these temporary alliances that evaporate the second priorities clash.
And you know that polite distance doesn't come out of nowhere either. The root cause is identified here as scarcity theology.
Scarcity theology.
Yeah, it's this underlying and often subconscious belief that God's resources, whether we're talking about major donors or eager volunteers or even cultural influence, are a zero-sum game.
So if someone else wins, I lose.
That's the fear. It's this deep-seated anxiety that if another organization down the street succeeds or gets the spotlight, it somehow diminishes your own organization's slice of the pie.
That sounds exhausting. Just operating from a place where everyone else is a threat to your survival.
It is exhausting, and it leads to intense donor anxiety. Leaders end up structuring their entire vision around funder priorities and brand protection rather than looking around and asking, how can we genuinely collaborate to solve the problem we both claim to care about?
I love the visual used in the notes to counter that scarcity mindset. It's called the story of two fires.
Oh, this is a great one.
Yeah, so imagine two small fires burning separately on a freezing windy night. On their own, they might give off a tiny bit of warmth, but they're both actively struggling to survive the wind. They're super vulnerable.
Right, they easily get blown out.
But if you take the logs from those two separate fires and bring them together, the dynamic changes completely. The flames rise higher, and they burn significantly hotter, and they actually become a self-sustaining furnace.
The wind that was going to blow them out actually feeds the larger fire.
Exactly. The idea here is that organizations that remain isolated burn out faster, but when they converge, they become this massive furnace of witness and impact.
Which brings us to the theological foundation behind all of this. What's so interesting is that this isn't just treated as a clever management strategy or a neat synergy hack.
Right, it goes way deeper.
It's rooted deeply in the radical theology of the body. It points all the way back to the Apostle Paul writing centuries ago to the Corinthian church.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When Paul describes the church as a body in 1 Corinthians 12, it's totally natural to read that as just a cute, sentimental metaphor for getting along.
Like we're all one big happy family.
Yeah, but that's not what it is.
Yeah.
The notes refer to this as operational theology. It's meant to literally dictate how organizations actually function on a Tuesday morning. Paul was writing to a church that was highly gifted and very active, but deeply divided by factionalism and people seeking status. Sound familiar?
Very familiar. And Paul's response to them wasn't to offer a new managerial flowchart or structural reform. He completely dismantled the illusion that effectiveness can flow from isolated excellence.
Right, he used a pretty intense physical image.
He did. Think about the stark, almost violent reality of this metaphor. Imagine a hand physically severed from a human body. It might still structurally look like a perfect hand. It has all the fingers and the bones and the muscles.
But it's completely dead.
Exactly. It has no life, no power, and zero ability to function. The viewpoint here is that when ministries insist on operating in total isolation from the wider community, it is not merely an issue of inefficiency, it is actual spiritual dysfunction. A severed hand simply cannot serve the body.
And I always assumed that a call for collaboration meant everyone had to compromise and act the same and sort of lose their unique identity. But this reading pushes back on that hard.
It does. It makes the case that diversity is an intentional design, not a problem to be solved.
Paul literally says that a body made entirely of eyes would be grotesque and completely dysfunctional. You can't hear with an eye. You need hands, and you need feet, and you need ears.
The diversity of gifts and callings and cultural expressions is an absolute necessity.
Right. The danger isn't difference. The danger is when those differences are disconnected from a shared identity.
What's fascinating here is how this operational theology connects back to Jesus' own words. There is a powerful theological anchor brought out from John chapter 17.
The unfinished prayer.
Yes. Jesus' unfinished prayer prayed the night before his crucifixion. If you look at what he actually prayed for, he didn't pray for his followers to have better communication strategies or massive buildings or bigger budgets.
He prayed that they may be one so that the world may believe.
Let's pause on that logic. So that the world may believe.
That directly ties internal unity to outward impact.
Exactly. Unity isn't just some internal virtue for everyone to feel warm and fuzzy about. It is presented here as the ultimate evangelistic witness. The logic is piercing. A divided, fragmented community preaching a message of universal reconciliation sounds entirely hollow to the outside world.
It totally undercuts the message.
How can a community claim to hold the ultimate message of peace if its own internal organizations view each other as rivals? The credibility of the message is intrinsically, permanently linked to the visible unity of the messengers.
That is a heavy concept for anyone listening who works in this space. I mean, it's easy to nod along, But the natural question is, how do we actually bridge this gap?
That's the real challenge.
If we are currently stuck in our silos
Hmm.
and comfortably separated by that polite distance, how do we move toward this unified body? Well, there's a very specific currency required for this kind of collaboration, and that currency is trust.
Yes, trust. It's defined here as spiritual capital. In the economy of collective mission, trust is the invisible infrastructure that makes absolutely everything else possible.
It's foundation.
And just like real financial capital, trust is built painstakingly slowly, but it can be spent or destroyed in an instant.
I know there's a historical example used to illustrate this from the early church in Acts chapter 6. It talks about a real crisis of division between Greek-speaking and Hebrew-speaking widows. Can you break down what was actually happening there?
It's a crucial story. In the early days of the church, there was a daily distribution of food to the widows who were the most vulnerable people in the society. But a massive cultural and racial tension flared up because the Greek-speaking widows were being neglected in favor of the local Hebrew-speaking widows.
Wow, so a real crisis.
A crisis that could have fractured the entire movement. So what did the apostles do? They didn't micromanage the food line. They didn't issue a top-down corporate mandate.
They delegated.
They delegated their authority to 7 trusted deacons from within the community to handle it. They relied entirely on relational credibility that had been built over time to solve a systemic issue.
That takes a lot of letting go.
It does. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is a profound point about control versus empowerment. When leaders operate out of scarcity, they tend to cling to unilateral control. They want their hands on every lever.
But the argument is that this actually restricts the work of the Holy Spirit.
Yes, trust liberates the Spirit to work. True spiritual authority flows from relational credibility on the ground, not positional power or brand dominance.
But to build that kind of trust, we have to radically shift how we measure success, right? Because if you and I decide to collaborate, but my board of directors is still measuring my success purely by my individual attendance charts or my solo budget growth,
Sure.
I'm inevitably going to default back to competition.
Because you have to survive.
Exactly.
That is the crux of the practical problem. You can't use individualistic metrics to measure collective success. The shift proposed here is moving toward measuring what are called kingdom indicators.
Kingdom indicators.
Yes, they're communal metrics rather than individual ones.
So what are these kingdom indicators? What do they actually look like in practice?
There are 3 specific areas to look at. The first is shared transformation. Instead of asking how many people showed up to our Tuesday night program, the question becomes, are our actual neighborhoods changing?
Like, are local crime rates dropping? Are vulnerable families flourishing?
Exactly. This measures the work through the collective body rather than just pointing a spotlight at one single ministry's busy movement.
That makes so much sense. And the second indicator?
The second is collective credibility. This asks if the wider civic community, like the local government, the school boards, the neighborhood associations, actually trusts the unified church.
Or do they just see a chaotic, disjointed landscape of competing programs?
Right. Collective credibility happens when the outside world sees a consistent, aligned presence that they can rely on.
Okay, and the third?
Sustained faithfulness. This is about prioritizing long-term fidelity over flashy, immediate success. It's the shared commitment to persist through inevitable setbacks and leadership transitions and financial strains together.
So valuing sustainable generational change over short-term outputs that might look great on a quarterly donor report, but just fade away a year later.
Precisely.
To bring this entirely out of the realm of theory, there is a really compelling real-world case study included in our sources today. It paints a picture of a major metropolitan city that had hundreds of active, vibrant charities and churches.
And from the outside, it looked like a thriving hub of activity.
Oh, absolutely. They were pouring millions of dollars and countless volunteer hours into outreach, running soup kitchens, mentoring youth, you name it. But despite all that faithful, exhausting effort, they are making absolutely no measurable dent in the city's local poverty addiction or crime rates.
It was the absolute perfect example of parallel efforts failing to transform a community.
Everyone was rowing hard, but the boat wasn't moving.
And the breakthrough in that city is fascinating. It didn't start with a massive merger or a multi-million-dollar campaign. It began simply with leaders and pastors gathering regularly just to listen to each other and pray together.
Slowly and intentionally building that spiritual capital of trust.
Yes. And once that trust was established, they made a radical shift to a model of specialization with mutual support.
I love this part. Because giving up the we have to do everything mentality is so hard.
It's incredibly hard. Instead of every single organization trying to run its own duplicate food pantry or its own underfunded youth group, which they often did poorly because their resources were stretched so thin, they aligned their strengths.
Right. One organization took all their resources and focused entirely on community development and affordable housing. Another dedicated itself completely to leadership training and equipping volunteers for the whole city.
And a third focused heavily on family services counseling and foster care support.
While a fourth concentrated on evangelism and spiritual formation, they stopped competing. They actually aligned their budgets, coordinated their calendars, and created a unified public message.
And the measurable results were remarkable. Crime rates actually dropped in their targeted neighborhoods.
The local schools stabilized too because the tutoring and after-school programs were finally integrated and well-funded rather than scattered.
And significantly, going back to that collective credibility indicator, the city's civic leaders finally had a cohesive, reliable partner to work with. They weren't dealing with 50 fragmented, competing agendas anymore.
So what does this all mean for the long haul? Because, let's be totally honest, human ego, leadership burnout, and organizational stress are very real things.
Very real.
I can imagine everyone getting along great for the first year, but how does this actually survive? This perspective doesn't pretend collaboration is a permanent, effortless state. It takes work. So how is this unity actively protected over time?
Because good intentions are never enough, right? Unity requires actual form. The strategy detailed here is called structural scaffolding.
Structural scaffolding.
There are 3 key structures needed to keep the building from collapsing. First is shared governance. This means actively rotating leadership roles and insisting on consensus decision-making.
You do this so that no single mega organization or charismatic personality can eventually dominate the partnership and turn it back into an empire. The second part of that scaffolding is creating memorandums of spiritual understanding. And these aren't supposed to be dry, corporate legal contracts that get shoved in a drawer.
No, they are formal living documents. They clarify the shared vision. They explicitly define the expectations for how resources will be shared. And crucially, they establish pathways for conflict resolution before the conflict even happens.
It is literally putting covenantal trust down on paper so everyone is accountable.
Finally, the scaffolding insists on scheduled rhythms of repentance and reconciliation. Conflict is inevitable. Whenever humans work together, toes will be stepped on.
Right.
The model used here points back to the early church's Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. When a massive theological and missional crisis arose that threatened to split the early believers, they didn't just ignore it or send passive-aggressive scrolls to each other.
They gathered diverse representation, facilitated intense but open dialogue, and reached a collective decision.
Modern partnerships need scheduled intentional spaces to confess misalignments, mediate disagreements, and actively repair trust before the structural scaffolding completely breaks down.
If you are listening to this right now, and you are engaged in any kind of mission-driven work, community building, or collaborative project, this entire deep dive is challenging a fundamental shift in your perspective.
It really is.
True lasting impact requires moving away from the isolated individualistic question of how can my organization grow and moving toward the collective question of how can our shared witness deepen.
This raises an important question for your own context right where you are. Where is the momentum already building around you? Where are people already rowing in the same direction?
Yeah.
The challenge here is to stop treating unity as an optional enhancement, a nice-to-have feature, and to recognize it as a divine multiplier. The math changes when we work together. The most actionable step you can take based on this material is to prioritize relationship over recognition today.
Yes. The challenge isn't to go out and architect a massive corporate merger tomorrow. It's to find just one intentional partnership in your own life right now and test it with a small obedience, a micro-collaboration.
Host a joint event with someone you normally view as a competitor.
Coordinate a single volunteer effort together. Share one valuable resource with no strings attached. Test the waters of trust and see what kind of momentum can be built when you stop rowing alone.
Exactly.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought from our sources. We saved this for the very end because it beautifully reframes everything we've talked about. The text describes this kind of unified shared mission as an eschatological rehearsal.
An eschatological rehearsal.
Now, for anyone who doesn't spend their weekends reading thick theology textbooks, eschatological simply means having to do with the end of the world or the ultimate destiny of humanity. So an eschatological rehearsal is literally a rehearsal for heaven.
A practice run for the perfected, reconciled community at the end of all things.
Let that sink in. If unity is a rehearsal for heaven reflecting the eternal design of a perfectly reconciled world, then every time we choose territorial competition, ego, and polite division, what kind of future are we rehearsing for? It is a profound question to ponder as you consider how your daily collaborations or lack thereof are shaping eternity. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.